Gonzaga moves up one spot to number 18 in the AP poll, although the net still has them inside the top 10. What does that all mean for Mark Few's club?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Randy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode is brought to you, by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Well, the Zags remain a top 20 team in the AP poll. They are number 6 in the net rankings. They have 5 quad 1 games still on the calendar. We're going to break down this team's remaining schedule, take a look around the WCC in the early part of conference play, and then close out the show with a couple of straggling mailbag questions that were asked right after I recorded the show yesterday. Lots of fun stuff for you today. We'll start with the AP results this week. The Zags move up one spot. They were number 19 last week. They move up to number 18 this week. Despite going 3-0 last week, obviously the quality of the opponent is taken into consideration here. The Zags' best win out of this last week was against LMU, who's a good team, but not a great team. And while the Zags went 3-0, there's not exactly going to be a lot of consideration for Gonzaga's win over a very bad Portland team, and frankly, a Pepperdine team that's not very good either, and that Gonzaga didn't look particularly impressive against on Monday. So for the Zags to be moving up, normally you go 3-0, you're going to move up more than one spot, but this felt fairly reasonable considering the circumstances, considering what happened around them in college basketball this past week. Because of the way the rankings shook out this week, the Zags, who have 4 losses on the season, are 0-4 against ranked teams. They have not beaten a team that is currently ranked in the AP Top 25. Meanwhile, all 4 of the teams that they lost to are in fact ranked. I suppose that's better than the alternative where they would be 0-3 against ranked teams, having beaten, let's say, West Virginia, who until recently was not in the top 25, but West Virginia, after knocking off Kansas for the first time on the road in I believe ever for the West Virginia Mountaineers. That's a huge win for Darian DeVray's team. They are now a ranked team. Kentucky is at number 6. UConn is at number 9. West Virginia at 21, one spot ahead of the Bruins of UCLA, who are down at 22 after a disappointing week last week with that loss to Nebraska. So for the Zags, it's unfortunate. You never want to see a team be 0-4 against ranked teams. For Gonzaga, that's just not what we're typically used to. They typically play better against those ranked teams. We know that. That's been part of the conversation with this team this year. And for the record, they have beaten 3 teams who, while they are not currently in the top 25, are receiving votes as top 25 teams. One of them is Baylor, who has enough votes to be considered 29th in the AP poll. Baylor has a big game this week against Cincinnati. They're able to win that game. I wouldn't be surprised if they sneak back into the top 25 at some point. The good thing about being in the Big 12, and the bad thing, is that when you're in the Big 12, you have pretty much opportunities to pick up major wins, potentially ranked wins, almost every single week of conference play. So for Scott Drew and the Bears, you string together a couple wins in a row, and suddenly you're back in that top 25 conversation. The flip side is eventually you take enough losses that it starts to get harder and harder to get back into that conversation. We'll see what happens with the Bears. For Gonzaga, they're going to treat that win. It's going to be a win that is viewed favorably by the committee. It's viewed favorably, certainly, by Gonzaga, whether or not Baylor actually is in the top 25 or not. But at this current moment, it is not a ranked win for the Zags. San Diego State is just behind Baylor. They're 32nd in terms of receiving votes. We'll see. They're not quite in the same position in the sense that they don't have as many marquee opportunities to pick up wins. They had that huge lead against Utah State that they blew. They lost that game to Utah State. Had they won that one, I think they'd probably be in the top 25 at this point, but unfortunately they were unable to do so. So they were just on the outside looking in. Indiana still picking up votes for the top 25. They got a nice win over Penn State. I say nice in the sense that the win looks good because Penn State's a pretty good team. It was a really ugly game for Indiana, but hey, a win is a win. They were picked up enough votes to be 39th, but would have to do some pretty impressive stuff against Purdue or UCLA or some of the other best teams in the Big Ten in order to seriously get consideration to be a top 25 team again. None of Gonzaga's future opponents, which is obviously all WCC teams, are in the top 25 or even receiving any votes at this point. St. Mary's has enough issues with their resume at this point to not be considered for getting votes. Same with Washington State, who had that loss to Washington, which is really kind of keeping them out of that conversation for right now. San Francisco, Oregon State, the rest of the WCC, just not in a spot realistically where they should be getting top 25 votes or likely will put themselves in a position to get top 25 votes, even if they win out. Maybe if they beat Gonzaga and St. Mary's, some of those teams will start getting some votes, but I'd be surprised to see anybody outside of maybe St. Mary's realistically getting in consideration to be a top 25 team. But while the Zags are 18th in the AP poll, and while the rest of the WCC is not getting a lot of AP love right now, the AP poll, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it certainly doesn't drive consideration for the NCAA tournament and for seeding and things that really do matter for Gonzaga. That's the net has a lot more cachet in that area, and Gonzaga's viewed far more favorably. Right now, the net rankings, as I'm recording this on Monday afternoon, the Zags are 6th in the net. They are 2-4 in quad one games. We've talked about all of them. All 4 losses in quad one are all the 4 ranked teams that they've lost to. All of the losses that they have, West Virginia, Kentucky, UConn, and UCLA, while the 2 quad one wins, San Diego State on the road and Baylor at home. For the purposes of the net, that game against Baylor at the Spokane Arena counts as a home game. Gonzaga's 2-0 in quad 2 games. That would be the win at home against Arizona State and the neutral site win against Indiana in the Battle for Atlantis. They are 4-0 in quad 3 games, as UMass Lowell has now played their way into being a quad 3 game for the Zags. Pepperdine and LMU are also both quad 3 games for Gonzaga, as well as Davidson, the other game Gonzaga won in the Battle for Atlantis. And then their 4 remaining wins are all quad 4. That's Long Beach State, Nichols, Bucknell, and that home win last week against the Pilots of Portland. A reminder for how the quad system works, just for those of you who need it. A quad 1 game is a home game where you played an opponent that is ranked 1st through 30th in the net ranking. A neutral site is 1st through 50th. An away game is 1st through 75th. Quad 2, home game 31 through 75, neutral 51 through 100, road game 76 through 135, and then quad 3 and quad 4, it kind of just escalates from there. What I want to do is talk about a few of the games that Gonzaga has already played and how likely they are to potentially move up and down in and out of those quadrants, knowing that, of course, any team could go on a torrid hot streak and dramatically move up the rankings, whereas another team could plummet in the rankings. But right now, we're far enough into the season that teams are they're probably not going to have these huge swings. Most teams won't, at least. So we kind of have a decent sense of what may or may not change for the Zags in terms of the games that they've already played. Baylor right now is number 24 in the net, and because that is considered a home game and not a neutral site game, they need to stay top 30. I think Baylor is going to stay top 30. Again, the good side for Gonzaga is that being in the Big 12 means pretty much every game that they play is a good game from a metrics perspective. So even if they take some losses, which they will, it's not going to hurt them that much, and big wins are going to help them. So I'd be fairly surprised if Baylor fell out of the top 30. But that is kind of the only quad 1 game that feels very likely to change for Gonzaga. So that's good news that they're probably not going to lose any of their quad 1 results at this point. Indiana's at 56. If they get into the top 50, that becomes a quad 1 win for Gonzaga. That's one to keep an eye on. As much as, Indiana obviously have Umar Ballo on the roster, and so I think there's a sentiment of maybe not wanting to root for Indiana. I even posted on Blue Sky that Indiana's a really hard basketball team to watch, but in theory, we're rooting for Indiana because if they can climb into the top 50, that gives Gonzaga a 3rd quad 1 victory, which would be very helpful from a seeding perspective at the NCAA tournament. LMU is at number 146. If they climb into the top 135, that quad 3 win the Zags have would become a quad 2 win. Probably not a huge difference maker for Gonzaga, but any little bit helps. And having that game be in the quad 2 as opposed to quad 3 would be a good thing for the Zags. And then last but not least, Davidson, They're 110th right now in the net. If they move into the top 100, because that is a neutral site game, that would go from being a quad 3 win to a quad 2 win. A10 is a competitive enough conference that Davidson should have opportunities against teams like VCU and Dayton, and even George Washington's playing well this year. If they can pick up enough quality wins to move from 110 to 100, again, that's another bump for Gonzaga to a quad 2 win from being quad 3 as it is currently. So not only are those things some good news for the Zags regarding Indiana and Davidson and potentially LMU, but the Zags already have 2 quad 1 wins. At this time last year, they didn't have any, and they have 5 more quad 1 opportunities currently on the schedule. We're going to talk about that and what about that might potentially change coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, the college hoop season is here, and there's nothing better than the atmosphere of a college basketball game, especially in conference play, the anticipation of what's about to happen, the energy of the crowd, Zombie Nation blaring through the loudspeakers, all of that and more. And folks, Game Time now has a feature called Game Time Picks that helps make getting tickets to see your favorite team play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands and thousands of different tickets. And of course, it's not just for basketball. You want to go check out some baseball when the season rolls around. Not a lot of football games left, but there's still a few NFL games or some playoff games if you want to see that. They also have tickets for concerts, for comedy shows, for theater, all of that as well. And whether it's Game Time's ticketing coverage, their lowest price guarantee, or the panoramic views from your seat in the app feature, Game Time has you covered. Gonzaga's taking on Oregon State in Corvallis next week, January 16th, one of those quad 1 games we're about to talk about. I'm going to be in the house at that game with my dad. If you want to come say hi, tickets are just $17 a piece in the upper balcony, and you can get sideline tickets in section U12, and they're just $26 a piece right now on Game Time. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets by using Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. You can get 2 tickets for barely $20 total if you use Game Time and you use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're still talking about the net rankings, Gonzaga's schedule up to this point, what may or may not change in the net regarding the quad 1 and quad 2 games that Gonzaga's already played. Now we're going to take a look at the rest of Gonzaga's schedule, which of course at this point is all WCC matchups. There's no mid-February game against Kentucky like there was last year, which kind of served as a catalyst for the strong second half or strong finish to the season for Mark Few's club. But while last year at this time, the Zags were in a much more precarious position. There was real concern about the streak of making the NCAA tournament ending. There was real concern about the Zags picking up any quad 1 opportunities. And now, as we already said, the Zags have 2 quad 1 games. They're very unlikely to move. I think Baylor's going to stay in the quad 1. San Diego State is very likely to stay in the quad 1, barring an epic collapse for them. But more than that, currently, the way the schedule shapes up, the Zags have 5 more quad 1 opportunities. They also have 5 quad 2 opportunities, only 1 remaining game that is currently quad 3, and then 4 quad 4 games. That's a sign of the growth of the WCC. 10 of Gonzaga's 15 remaining games, 2/3 of the remaining games on Gonzaga's schedule are either quad 1 or quad 2. For people who want to continue to complain about the WCC, yes, of course, it's not a power conference. It's not on the level of what the future Pac-12 is going to be for Gonzaga. But 2/3 of the remaining game for the Zags are quad 1, quad 2 opportunities. That is a big, big deal. Right now, the 5 quad 1 games left on Gonzaga's schedule: at Oregon State, again, that game coming up later this month, at St. Mary's, at Washington State, at Santa Clara, and at San Francisco. All 5 of Gonzaga's quad 1 opportunities are true road games. That San Francisco game will be at the Chase Center, but for the purposes of net, they are counting that as a true road game for Gonzaga, just like Baylor is playing at the Spokane Arena is counted as a true road game for them. Now, 3 of the teams that Gonzaga, 3 of these quad 1 games are somewhat tenuous in terms of whether they're going to stay quad 1 games. Oregon State is 66th in the net as I'm recording this right now. Washington State is 65th, and Santa Clara is 71st. All of those teams would need to stay inside the top 75 to remain quad one games. So all of these, if any of these teams stumble too much going forward this year, they could drop out of that top 75 and potentially drop from being quad one opportunities for Gonzaga to being quad two opportunities for Gonzaga. The 5 quad two games are literally those same 5 teams, just flipped from being away games to home games. So Washington State, Santa Clara, Oregon State, San Francisco, St. Mary's, all 5 of those teams are playing Gonzaga on the road and at home. The 5 home opportunities for Gonzaga are all currently quad 2 games. Gonzaga's remaining home game against LMU is quad 3. And then their quad 4 games are San Diego, at Portland, at Pacific, and then their home game against the Pepperdine Waves. So that's where we're at right now with Gonzaga and their schedule. Again, these things change on a day-to-day, game-by-game basis. But for right now, things are looking promising for Gonzaga in terms of having plenty of opportunities to pick up. At the end of the year, they could have a resume with 5-6 quad one wins on it, which really puts them in a quality position in terms of NCAA tournament seeding and gives them a very large cushion if they are unable to win the WCC tournament and don't get that automatic bid into the big dance. Want to do a little bit of a WCC wraparound where we're at for most teams, 3 to 4 games into the conference slate. There are 3 remaining undefeated teams in the West Coast Conference. Gonzaga, of course, is 3-0 alongside St. Mary's and Washington State. Most people could have probably guessed that those would be the 3 undefeated teams remaining. Folks might have guessed San Francisco, who is 3-1 on the year, but obviously we know what Gonzaga's done. St. Mary's, fairly similar start for them. 1 not so great game, 2 great games against fairly easy opponents. St. Mary's has played Pacific, Pepperdine, and Portland. Doesn't get a whole lot easier than that to start conference play. They got a tougher test tonight as they place LMU, although they are at home against the Lions on Tuesday evening for the Gales. Washington State has a win over Portland on the road. They beat LMU and San Francisco at home. That win over San Francisco is big time for the Cougars. It was a 9-point win. To me, that game felt like whichever team wins that game continues to have a glimmer of a hope of getting an at-large bid into the NCAA tournament. Whichever team didn't win that game, in this case, the Dons, probably saw that light diminished fully for them at this point. I think San Francisco is probably WCC championship or bust in terms of getting into the NCAA tournament. Maybe if the planets align and they win every single game, including sweeping Gonzaga and St. Mary's, and then they lose the WCC championship, that's probably enough to get them into the tournament, but it's the margin of error outside of that is basically nothing for the Dons. For Washington State, they host Pacific on Thursday. The Dons had a nice overtime win over Santa Clara. Christoph Tilley was at the free throw line with 0.9 seconds left in a tie game, missed the free throw, sending it to overtime, where San Francisco was able to win. A heartbreaking loss for the Broncos. For San Francisco, they play Portland at home on Thursday, should be moving to 4-1 there. Santa Clara has that 1 loss to San Francisco. They have 2 wins, beat Pepperdine by 11, only beat San Diego by 1. That was a bit of a surprise to see that. Their Herb Sendek's team has been pretty up and down so far this season. They got Oregon State on Thursday. Oregon State themselves has beat UP and San Diego, but they got smacked by LMU by 21 points. The Lions beating them on the road. The Lions beat them at home. Oregon State went on the road and lost that game by 21 points, completely derailing a season that up to that point still had a little bit of a hope of being an at-large bid. That is gone with a 21-point loss to LMU. Outside of that, San Diego's 1-2. LMU and Pepperdine are both 1-3. Pacific and Portland, somewhat unsurprisingly, both 0-4 to start conference play. Last thing here before we get to our mailbag questions, some of the conference leaders at this point. The leading scorer in the conference is Malik Thomas from San Francisco. He's averaging 20.4 points per game. Stefan Todorovic from Pepperdine is next at 19.5, former San Francisco Don, who's now playing for the Waves. In terms of rebounds, Paulos Morauskas from St. Mary's, 8.8, tied with Santiago Truete from San Diego, also at 8.8. And then third is Mikey Ritage from Oregon State at 8.3. Your assist leader in the WCC, the only stat that Gonzaga has the leader, of course, Ryan Nembhard, 9.6 assists per game, well ahead of Mo Odom, who is second at 7.4, and Pacific's Lamar Washington, who is at 6.2. Bilal Coulibaly from Pepperdine is at 1.8 blocks per game to lead the conference, just ahead of ND Okafor, who is at 1.6 for Washington State. And then LMU's Javon Porter is next at 1.5. And then steals, Mikey Rataj from Oregon State, one of the better, not as well recognized, but very talented players in the conference. Rataj has 2.2 steals per game. Malik Thomas is next at 2.1, followed by KJ Bradley from San Diego at 1.9. All right, folks, we had a few mailbag questions that spilled over to today's show. Didn't get to them on Monday, but wanted to address them here. One of them is a discussion on part of this team's issue and whether the team just doesn't have enough mouths to feed. They don't have enough touches to go around for so much talent on the roster. We're going to talk about that, what we think about that, compare it to some previous Gonzaga rosters, all that and more coming up in just a second. But first, folks, conference play is here, and it is time to tackle the college hoops action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. We talked about this game earlier. St. Mary's hosting LMU tonight. Gales are favored by 12.5 points at FanDuel with the over-under set at 134.5. Both teams a little bit tough to nail down right now, but I don't typically trust St. Mary's to win games by a huge margin. And this LMU team looked good against Oregon State. They're going to be a little pissed off after that game against Gonzaga. I wouldn't be surprised. I think St. Mary's wins, but I would not be surprised if LMU covers that spread. If you like those odds, if you like any of the other future odds on FanDuel, just check it out, FanDuel.com. As a reminder, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets if you win your first bet of $5 or more. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're closing out the show with a trio of mailbag questions that got submitted shortly after I hit the record button for Monday's show. So we're going to address them here. This first question comes from Christian via Gmail. Christian says, is part of the conundrum with this team that there are not enough touches for everyone to reach their potential in every game? It seems like the leading scorer could be any of the 8 main rotation players for any given game. Is this new, or can you think of another Zag team that was similar in this regard? I like this question because I think it's true in the sense that I do think that this team has the balance where any given night it could be Graham Ike, it could be Khalif Battle, it could be Ryan Nembhard. Like there is a lot of variety in terms of who could lead this team. And I think that this is a very positive way to spin it and a positive way to look at this team's roster construction and their kind of, to use your word, conundrum regarding how the team is played. I think another perhaps more negative way to spin this question is that it kind of implies they don't have a leading scorer. And I think what happens, and I think we're both kind of saying the same thing here, just in a different way, but is that it almost feels like Gonzaga goes into games kind of not knowing who's going to dominate. Like, we're going to feed the ball to Graham Ike. Okay, Graham's not playing well. Now do we go to Battle? Do we go to Nembhard? Do we go to, Ben Gregg? Do we try to get him going? Do we just switch out Ike and Huff and let Braden cook? Like, what are we going to do? And it does feel like that's part of the reason we see some slow starts, is they're almost trying to figure out who's the guy today. Who is it? And it's like, when you just have like a go-to dude, like Drew Timme, for example, like you go to Drew every single game. And on the extremely rare chance where Drew has a bad game, you make an adjustment from there. But this year's team, nobody's consistent enough that you can just rely on them. Nembhard is the most consistent player on this team, but he is not a consistent scorer. That's not what he's asked to do. Graham has not been that consistent. He's been much better lately. And ideally, he stays consistent for the rest of the year. But there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. So I think the problem for this team is they don't have a go-to guy. Like, let's look at the 2020-21 team, which is probably the best Gonzaga basketball team roster-wise that they've ever had. So we're not comparing these two. This team is not as good as the 2020-21 team. No shame in that. It's just true. They're not. But that team had a ton of guys who could lead you any night. Drew Timme could lead you any given night. So could Corey Kispert. So could Joel Ayayi. But when the team needed a bucket, they went to Jalen Suggs. Like, that, he was the guy who, we need a bucket. We need points right now. We need a clutch shot. We're going to Jalen. This team does not have that. This team is probably most similar in the recent memory to the 2017-2018 team. That team had Jonathan Williams, Zach Norvell, Killian Tilly, Josh Perkins, and Rui Hachimura all averaged between 11.6 and 13.4 points per game. Jonathan Williams led the team with 13.4 points per game. I think Norvell was like 12.9. Tilly was like 12.6. Perkins was like 12.1. Rui was 11.6. Something basically right in that range. All of them were within 2 points per game of each other. And then you had Silas Melson not that far behind at 9.3. But the problem was they didn't have a super obvious go-to guy. Norvell had hit a lot of clutch shots in his career. I think he was probably the go-to guy on that team. But it wasn't super consistent. This wasn't Rui's All-American year. He was a year away from being that guy. So that team was very good. They went 32-5. They got a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament, but they needed snacks to bail them out of a potential upset loss to UNC Greensboro in the first round, a 13-seeded team. They did beat Ohio State in the second round, a 5 seed, but it was like a 6-point game. I think Snacks hit a couple clutch threes in that game as well. And then they lost to Florida State in the Sweet 16 because Killian Tilly was unavailable, and they just could not deal with that team's size and length. That was a team that was relatively disappointing. Again, 32-5, 17-1 in the conference. This year's version of the WCC is better than that year's version of the WCC, but that's kind of the closest team I could find in terms of comparisons. I'm not sure if this team is as good as that team head to head. It would be an interesting matchup, certainly, to kind of see how it would go. But I think it's the closest comparison in terms of not having an obvious go-to guy, because really for the last 4 or 5 years prior to the last few years, Drew Timme was that guy, and they haven't really had that guy this year. Next 2 questions both come from Brandon via Gmail. Brandon says, I know there's been some issues with ESPN Plus this year. I live in Montana and the games are still blacked out. Have you heard if this is going to change anytime soon? Brandon, I wish I could give you a definitive answer on this. I cannot. My understanding is that the expectation is that every game that is available on KHQ in that media market, so I believe the KHQ market extends Spokane. It extends outside of Spokane to the greater inland Northwest area, some areas in Idaho. I don't know if it extends into any parts of Montana. Certainly, I don't think it extends throughout Montana. It may extend into some of the western parts of Montana. But anywhere where KHQ's reach does not extend should be available on ESPN+. That is my understanding. If that is not the case, if you are finding that both KHQ and ESPN Plus are blacking you out of being able to watch the game, something is wrong. Again, this is my understanding of the situation. Stephen Carr is a great resource for this. He's the original host of Locked On Zags. He is now working at Gonzaga in their media department. He has worked with ESPN Plus, has worked with the TV partners to kind of try to rectify some of the issues we've seen this year. You can find him on social media. He's on Twitter. He's on Blue Sky. I did not know that this was an issue still impacting folks in Montana. So if that is the case, I would reach out to him to start, and hopefully they can get that sorted out, because that's very frustrating to not be able to watch the game that should be available in at least 2 different spots and should not be blacked out in both. Final question of the show, also from Brandon. Changing topics a bit, he says, wanted to get your thoughts on LeBron's youngest son choosing to play at Arizona. Yeah, I talked about this on the Locked On College Basketball show. For those of you who listen to that show as well as this show, we did cover it on, I believe, the January 2nd episode, because Bryce James committed to Arizona on the 1st of January. Bryce James, the youngest son of LeBron James, the younger brother of Bronny James. And to just kind of say quickly about who he is nowhere near the caliber of prospect as Bronny. And I know a lot of people thought Bronny was inflated, like he was rated too high by 247 Sports, and they cite his poor season at USC as an example of that. I think it's worth remembering that Bronny was less than a year removed from having a cardiac arrest episode the summer prior to his season at USC. I'm not saying that he was good at USC. He was not. His numbers were not very good as a freshman for the Trojans. But Bronny was a starter at Sierra Canyon High School. He was a very, very good high school player. He did deserve to be a fairly highly regarded prospect outside of being the son of LeBron James. Bryce, not the case. Bryce did not start at the same high school, Sierra Canyon. He is not even a top 250 prospect in the 2025 recruiting class, according to 247 Sports, a 3-star prospect, not even in the top 250. And he commits to Arizona. And yeah, part of the reason he's committing to Arizona is because he has the same last name as his dad. Let's be honest. That is part of the situation here. But Bryce was a very good 3-point shooter. That is really the only plus skill he has demonstrated at this point in his high school career. He has the bloodlines, and Arizona recruited him to be a developmental prospect. They recruited him because they wanted to see if he could develop into something more than just a three-point shooter, or even just somebody who can contribute as a player coming off the bench as a floor spacer. But also they're committing. They recruited Bryce and they landed Bryce because they wanted some notoriety. It brings some extra eyeballs to their team. It brings some extra attention, some pedigree, things of that nature. It's part of how it works. There's every reason to complain about nepotism in sports because it totally exists. But guess what? It exists everywhere. People get into colleges because of their parents all the time. This is just not something that is unique to college basketball or unique to college sports. It's just the reality of the situation. It's just what happens. The sons and daughters of famous people tend to get advantages that others do not. It's just kind of how it works. If Bryce doesn't pan out, they'll let him go. They'll request him enter the transfer portal and he'll look somewhere else. Maybe he'll end up going to Duquesne, which is what so many folks wanted Bronny to do in the transfer portal, because Duquesne is coached by LeBron's childhood friend and high school teammate. That would be very fun if Bryce were to do that, but we'll see what ends up happening. I wouldn't expect to see Bryce on the floor much at all as a freshman next season, and perhaps he'll be able to develop behind the scenes with Coach Lloyd and turn into a somewhere down the line, turn into a rotation player for the Wildcats. But I'm not exactly holding my breath for that to happen. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. We'll be back on Wednesday, getting you ready for Gonzaga's Wednesday evening game against Steve Lavin and the San Diego Toreros. We'll get you ready for that game. Talk about the Toreros, talk about Colby Brooks, who is playing at San Diego after being a walk-on at Gonzaga. We'll also talk about the keys to victory for that game. And then the rest of the week, we'll get you ready for that big-time matchup this Saturday against David Riley and the Washington State Cougars. Thanks again, folks, for listening. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.